Hello, third grade. Today we're going to be starting lesson 5, How Have Heroes Helped Communities? And so when you think of the word heroes, what do you think of or who do you think of with that word, associated with that word, connected to that word? And so while you're thinking of that, we're going to be talking about finding heroes in our history who have taken action and made a difference in their communities and maybe across the United States. We're going to be describing the ways that people work together to solve problems in a community. And then we're going to be writing about people who work to solve issues and the effects of their actions. So we're going to be continuing our topic of cause and effect, how one thing is connected to the other thing. And so here we have a photo of Anne Hutchinson, and she's defending her actions during a trial or during her trial in the colony of Massachusetts. And I want you to observe, what is the audience doing? Are they sitting and talking to each other, or do you think that they are observing and paying attention to what she's saying? And why do you think that she's trying to defend her actions? So when we think about defending something, we're saying that we are protecting something and we're trying to defend. In this case, she's trying to defend what she did. But what do you think that she did that she would have to defend it? And so let's go ahead and get started while you're still thinking of what's a hero. So maybe you've already thought of a specific person. Maybe you think that your parents are your heroes. Maybe you're thinking that someone famous in history is a hero or someone from your favorite show. Why do you think that these people qualify or count as heroes? So, what do they all have in common? And when we think of heroes, are they just people who talk? Or do you think that they are people who also do something? So when we think about someone being heroic, that means they are doing an action that is heroic, something that you think that a hero would do. So maybe they are trying to help people, maybe they are trying to protect people, maybe they're trying to do something for their communities. Well, let's go ahead and get started on our pages to see how Anne Hutchinson could be defined as a hero. Before we get started, make sure to read the inspect portion. So we're going to read the text all the way through, circle any words you don't know. Of course, if you're unsure about them, you can always use your glossary or you can leave a comment in the Google Classroom if you're not sure and you don't have a dictionary to check. Underline clues that tell you who Anne Hutchinson was. And then here it says highlight. So if you don't have a highlighter, you can go ahead and circle the clues that tell you where she lived. And so we're going to write down here, why was Anne Hutchinson put on trial? Then after we're done with our reading, you can reread it, underline words and sentences from the text that show how Anne Hutchinson stood up for her beliefs. Is it literally talking about her standing when they say stood up for her beliefs? Or what do you think they're trying to say when they say stood up for her beliefs? And why do you think it's important to stand up for something that you believe in? So let's go ahead and get started with our reading. Anne Hutchinson, a hero for freedom. And then afterwards, we're going to read our primary source.
Anne Hutchinson was born in England. Her father taught her to think for herself and to speak her mind. Anne sailed to Massachusetts with her family in 1634. They settled in Boston. Anne was very religious. She began to have meetings in her home. At these meetings, she talked about religion. She believed God taught everyone, not just ministers and men. Her ideas were different from what the people in her community taught and believed. The ministers who disagreed with Anne had her arrested. She was put on trial. During her trial, Anne Hutchinson stood by what she believed. She said only God could be her judge. The court ordered Anne to leave the community. She left, but she never gave up her ideas or her right to think for herself.
And so here we have our primary source. So this is directly from Anne Hutchinson. Now, if you do condemn me for speaking what in my conscience I know to be truth, I must commit myself unto the Lord. This is the examination of Mrs. Anne Hutchinson at the Court of Newton in 1637. And so now that we've read our portion, if you need to reread it, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead. And here we have our drawing with the caption, "The court orders Anne Hutchinson to leave Boston." Here, you had to underline clues that told you who she was, you had to highlight and all of that. So make sure that you've done all of your annotating, and then we can go ahead and continue. So when we think about what happened, we know that Anne Hutchinson was a person who was religious. We know that the people in the community didn't necessarily agree with what she did, and so they put her on trial. So when we talk about someone being on trial, they're trying to judge whether or not she is guilty or innocent of what they accuse her of. And so when we talk about her standing up for her beliefs, we're not literally talking about her just standing, right? They're not asking her to stand, but what they are asking her to do is defend what she thinks and why she thinks it. So she's trying to protect, she's trying to explain why she did what she did. And so then after that, when they disagreed with her, they told her to leave. But it said that she left, but she never gave up on her ideas or her right to think for herself. So we can also say that is another way to say she left, but she never stopped thinking that she was correct, and also that she never stopped explaining her ideas, because when she left, she didn't leave because she thought that she was wrong. The community thought that she was wrong. And so we know she didn't give up on her own thoughts. She stood up for them. And so now, when we talk about cause and effect, which is what we're going to do over here on this page, remember, a cause is why something happens, an effect is what happens as a result of something else. So an effect is what happens. Thinking about causes and effects will help you understand the events you read about. And so we've already read the text all the way through. If you need to reread it, you can go ahead and do that and look for something that tells you what else happened. And so then we need to read the text again. So reread the text again and look for details of why it happened. And here they gave us a cause and effect. The cause that they gave here in our graphic organizer is that Anne Hutchinson's ideas were different from the minister's ideas. So if we see that that's the cause, what is the effect? If you need to go back through your paragraphs and check again, we can go ahead and see in the third paragraph that Anne is arrested and she's put on trial. So because her ideas disagreed from the minister's, they arrested her and they put her on trial to see whether or not she was guilty for doing something wrong. And so once she did that, all of that counts as your effect. And so remember, sometimes when we talk about cause and effect, they give you clues inside of your text to show you that you're talking about cause and effect. How do they do that? Well, they say the word because, or they say as an effect, or even sometimes they'll even say as a result. If they're saying as a result, they're saying that this happened because of something else. It is resulting in something else. So if you ever see those code words, remember, they're saying that something happened, but you need to figure out what that something is. And so we can go ahead and get started on this page. Once you're done with that, we're going to go through pages 240 to 249. And continuing what we did in our last video, we're going to have different causes and different effects. So you can go ahead and find different causes from your textbook and then write the effects of those things. Remember, paraphrase them. You are not copying it directly from the text. You are putting it in your own words. You're explaining it in your own way. So there's going to be lots of different things that you're going to be reading about inside of our textbook pages, talking about one thing causing another thing, so one thing affecting another thing, and we're going to be talking about how this makes a hero. So for some people, Anne Hutchinson might be a hero because she is someone who stood up for her beliefs and she defended it, she explained it, but then even after that, the people in her community didn't agree, and so she left. But her standing up for her beliefs, especially in a time period where it wasn't necessarily something that was easy for women to do, because in the past, women were not given the same rights as men. And so if they thought something, they were not allowed to say it or they weren't allowed to express it in the way that they wanted to. So a lot of people, they might consider Anne Hutchinson a hero because she is someone who stood by her beliefs. She defended her beliefs. She explained it. She said that she was correct. She didn't change her ideas because of the people around her. And so now let's go ahead and get started on our textbook pages. We're going to be talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. We're going to be talking about some major people in American history, and of course, the American community. So we're on page 240 in your textbook pages. How have heroes helped communities? And what is a hero?
Heroes are people who make the world better for other people. They may be people who have done great things or behaved with great honor. They may be young or old, boys or girls. They may be famous people or everyday people. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, nurses, and others in your community are heroes. A hero could simply be someone who helps you feel better if you are having a bad day. Think about some of your everyday heroes.
So now that we've defined what heroes are, and yes, you could of course use your glossary, think about if you know anyone. It can be a person that is real or fictitious. So if you know someone that you think applies in your comic book, maybe it applies from a book that you've read or a movie that you've watched, think about whether you've seen anyone that can count as a hero. So remember, with our definition here, heroes are people who make the world better for other people. They're trying to help others. They're trying to do great things. Maybe they are behaving in a way that is very respectable, that is very well done. And maybe it's in a way that kind of put them in danger, but they were trying to protect other people or they're trying to help other people. See if you can think of anyone that might fit into that category. And we're going to continue on our next page, and then we're going to read our captions.
History is filled with heroes. Women and men fought for the freedoms we enjoy every day. They fought for freedom of speech, the right to vote, and the right to attend school. They fought so that all Americans would have equality, or equal rights. In this lesson, you will read about some of our nation's heroes. Many of them risked their lives to change their communities. They also changed our nation and the world. The stories of their lives will help you understand how people can solve problems and create positive changes.
So a common hero that you might think of is a firefighter, because a firefighter is someone who is trying to make the community better by helping if there's an emergency or something like that. You might think of Dr. Martin Luther King as being another hero of the community because he fought against segregation, he fought against unjust laws by helping other communities and helping his own, of course, to fight back legally. Because at the time, it was legal to have segregation. It was legal for them to be discriminated against. And then for some people, Thomas Jefferson might be a hero because he fought against the British. And he said that what they were doing was wrong as well. He wasn't literally fighting, but he was saying that using his words and, of course, his speeches, and later on helping write the Declaration of Independence, he helped lead the country towards independence. And at the time when the United States was very dependent on um, Britain, they needed leaders. So these are people who would be considered heroes. And then let's go ahead and give some more information. So for Martin Luther King, he sacrificed a lot, especially for what he believed in. He was arrested for protesting segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. He was in jail for a week. And then during that time, he wrote his well-known letters called Letter from Birmingham Jail. So in that letter, he stated that individuals had a moral responsibility to protest unjust laws. So he said that people have to fight back against any laws that they think are not fair. So, for example, enforced segregation, people being jailed without reasons, all of those different things. He said that nonviolent protests were very important. So that means not fighting, but protesting in a way that is not causing harm to someone is important because he believes that injustice, okay, so not being fair, no matter where it happened, is a threat to justice everywhere. So he's saying no matter how small it is, when someone is being unjust towards someone else, it is a problem worldwide. Because now that means that one person is getting treated unfairly, everywhere else is going to start doing the same thing. It's all interconnected. Some more common heroes or some more well-known heroes are organizations. So sometimes organizations will work together in order to have the best chance of success. A common one is known as Doctors Without Borders. So they're an organization that works together to make the world a better place because they respond to humanitarian crises. That means that anytime there is a medical emergency, maybe it's because of an earthquake, maybe it's because of a wildfire, maybe it's because there was a drastic, urgency because of some war happening. They are known to come in to respond to those issues and then treat people with whoever they are. So since the beginning, Doctors Without Borders has treated more than 100 million people and today has offices in multiple countries. So that way they're able to help others. Another situation where you might consider the people who were responsible heroes is during the Brown versus Board of Education. And so during that time, the United States, in the South especially, legally segregated African Americans from white schools. So if you were African American, you could not attend a white school. That also meant that you were not getting the same resources, you were not getting the same level of education. You might not be able to go to university or go to college. And so during that time, the Chief Justice Earl Warren uh, was the leader, and so the court came to a unanimous decision in favor of desegregating public schools, determining segregated schools were inherently unequal. So he was leading at the time, and he said yes, and all of them actually agreed that having separate schools was not something that was right. It was not something that was fair, and at the end of the day, it was not equal for the students. So when we think about our heroes, right? Heroes as in people who are doing things that are better for the community, then do you think that these people qualify? Do you think that people who are, sacrificing their time, their effort, their voices in order to say this thing is not okay, and then doing something in order to do this, are also counted as heroes? They might not be the heroes that you're thinking of with just maybe a firefighter or a police officer or someone that is known for, doing something courageous. It can also be someone who stood up to something that was incorrect. For example, Dr. Martin Luther King, or protesting in a way that was to call attention to a situation. So these people are putting themselves at risk because they are saying that this is very important, but now what can I do about it? So when we think about people being treated unequally, why do you think of heroes? Well, we know that heroes are people who are trying to make things better, right? And maybe they are trying to make things equal. So why are people who fought for equality considered heroes? Well, we know that those people are trying to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be heard, to be treated respectfully, and for equal rights. Let's go ahead and continue to our next page. So here we have American heroes. And we have the caption Franklin and Jefferson working on the Declaration of Independence. So Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were famous writers. They contributed to the creation of the Declaration of Independence. And then we're going to be talking about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And why are they important?
Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin are heroes who helped create our country. They worked together with others to write the Declaration of Independence. This document is dated July 4, 1776. It lists the reasons why Americans wanted to be free from Great Britain. Jefferson was a skilled writer who wrote most of the document. Benjamin Franklin was also important because of the work he did to form our government. Franklin was a member of the Constitutional Convention. He and other leaders organized the government of the new nation. Franklin asked Congress to end slavery in our new nation, but Congress refused. It took more than 70 years for another American hero named Abraham Lincoln to bring an end to slavery in the United States. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This was an executive order that freed our country's enslaved people. Lincoln spoke out against slavery and worked to end it.
So yes, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were part of the United States' creation. And of course, they were famous because of what they wrote as well as what they said. Benjamin Franklin was known for being a revolutionary, an American revolutionary, as well as Thomas Jefferson. But the ways that they did things was slightly different. The way that they approached things was very different. And um, later on, when slavery stayed legal as part of the United States, yes, Abraham Lincoln was someone who advocated for it to be removed. So he wanted it to be removed, especially during a time in the United States when it was causing a lot of turmoil. So it's causing a lot of issues between the North part and the South part, which the North part did not have slaves and the South part did. So in their words, Abraham Lincoln, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and part of states are, and henceforth shall be free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval, authorities thereof will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. So at the time, the Southern states did not want to let go of slavery, and so Abraham Lincoln, who uh, disagreed with the South having it and then the North um, not having slaves, he said no one should have it at all. And so he allowed the Navy, the Army, and the federal government to get involved to make sure that there was no slavery um, the way it had been done in the past. Did they have other forms of slavery? Yes. But at the time, it was illegal at this point in time. It became illegal using the 13th Amendment um, for regular people to have slaves. So here we have Abraham Lincoln as with a photo, and let's go ahead and continue.
Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass also worked to end slavery. Both were born into slavery. They were able to escape and then work to free others. Tubman risked her life leading enslaved people to freedom. The routes she followed and the houses where people could hide were known as the Underground Railroad. Tubman helped many people to freedom. Frederick Douglass taught himself to read and write. He started a newspaper to speak out against slavery. He gave speeches to tell how he suffered in slavery. Even after slavery became illegal, African Americans were not given the same rights as other people. Douglass continued to work for equality for all people.
And so now that we've read both pages, I want you to think about how Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were alike. And so if you need to go ahead and go over that page again, you can. And then we're going to be talking about how Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass both did things in their own ways in order to be heroes for their community. So when we think about Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, well, we know that they both helped create our country and they both helped write the Constitution of the United States. Um, at one point, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were representatives of the United States. For Thomas Jefferson, I believe he was also a leader or a representative for a foreign nation at the time too. Using the information that we have, if you're not sure about the word emancipation, that word means setting someone free. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a document that said proclaimed, right? To proclaim something is to state that they were free. And so emancipation is saying that you are emancipating someone, you are freeing them. Proclamation is an official announcement. So the Emancipation Proclamation, which it says right here for the bottom of our primary source, is a statement, an official statement saying that people are free. And I know the word henceforward might seem like a very incorrect term, but it's actually part of English. We just don't really use it as much now. And so it means hence as in presently, and then forward in the future. So from now until later. So from now on is another way that we can use that term. When we think of the executive order, last in our one of our previous lessons, we've talked about the executive branch. And so yes, for the executive branch and executive orders, they are given by the president. And then when we think of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, when we think about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman was known for freeing slaves because she would go and actually walk with them in order to get them to the north where they would be free using the Underground Railroad, right? She did something very physical. Frederick Douglass wrote and spoke out against slavery. So he is still doing an action, but he is doing it in a different way in order to reach the same results. And so now when we think about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, what are some things that you noticed they have in common? Well, both of them help African Americans gain freedom, but Douglass was a African American himself, and he was enslaved in the past. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was not enslaved, but he still helped with that situation using his power as a president. So he used his position in order to help other people, and that's why some would consider him also a hero. And so you can think about how Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were similar because we're going to be using all of those details for our causes and our effects. And so if you've noticed anything that you think can work for your cause and effects for your workbook pages, you can go ahead and write them down. Maybe you want to talk about how Jefferson and Franklin worked together a lot. They ended up helping to write to the Constitution. That could be one cause and effect. Maybe you want to talk about how Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. As a result, slavery became illegal. Um, or maybe you want to talk about how Harriet Tubman was someone who helped free slaves because she fought back against the system that allowed slaves. She didn't think that the laws were correct, and so she did something about it. Maybe you want to talk about Frederick Douglass and how he disagreed with it as well. So he used his knowledge, he used his voice, he used his abilities in order to argue or to defend the thought that slavery was immoral. So these are all some causes and effects. If you wanted to use the other ones from here, you can talk about these as well, but these are not as detailed. You could talk about how Martin Luther King argued against segregation and against laws that were unfair. You could talk about how Thomas Jefferson fought against the British, not literally fighting, but, using his words. Let's go ahead and continue reading. And so we're going to be continuing talking about American heroes because we haven't had a new title. So if they don't give you a new heading, then that usually means we're staying on the previous topic.
As you have read, African Americans were not treated equally even after slavery ended. It took another 100 years and the work of heroes, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to bring equality to African Americans. Dr. King was an African American minister. He spoke out against segregation. This is the separation of people by the color of their skin. Dr. King asked government leaders to end this separation. He led peaceful protest marches. He refused to use violence to meet his goals. Dr. King was killed in 1968 while working for civil rights. The country celebrates his birthday each January. Many other American heroes risked their lives to bring equality to people. Before 1920, women in the United States were not allowed to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked to change that. They worked to bring equal rights to all women. Dennis Banks is another American hero. He helped found the American Indian Movement. The goal of this organization was to bring civil rights to Native Americans. Banks fought for fair and equal treatment for Native Americans.
So here we have a couple more American heroes. Why do you think they're American heroes? What do you think that was important? So while you're thinking about that, we're going to read our caption, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And yes, this is a cutout version of him, but we saw that on our previous pages, we're continuing the topic of American heroes. Here, we saw that we were talking about how Dr. Martin Luther King, even after slavery was illegal, that didn't automatically mean that laws were fair now, but rather people started making more laws to be discriminatory or maybe to segregate because they didn't want to interact with people that they thought were less. And so they made laws, and so this is what caused segregation. And then Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the people who fought back against this because he said that these laws were unfair for African Americans. It was not just him. There were many other groups. There were many other people, of course, that were working alongside him. He is one of the most famous examples. And so that's why he's known as an American hero. Some other American heroes that we mentioned here are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They argued that it was not fair that women were not allowed to represent themselves in voting or that they weren't able to vote for leaders. And so our last paragraph down here is talking about Dennis Banks. And so he helped with the American Indian movement because he knew that his group were also being underrepresented, which means they're not visualized, not just physically, but they're not represented in Congress or in different positions, as in they are not being spoken to, they are not being heard. And so he is trying to make sure that his people are heard. How is he doing that? Well, he is trying to help them unify, work together in order to make sure that their rights are being given to them. And so when we think about each of them, we know that each of them had their own individual groups that they were trying to take care of, But when they all work together, right, everyone trying to benefit their group, they're going to also benefit the United States as a whole. And so that's why they're all American heroes. So maybe you wanted to talk about how a cause and effect that you noticed was that there were unfair laws after the Emancipation Proclamation. As a result, we had the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King fought against that. Maybe you want to talk about how there were laws that did not allow women to vote. And so without being able to vote, they were not able to represent themselves. They were not able to be in positions of command or in power. And so that meant that women were not able to do as much. And that means that other people were able to make laws about them that they could not choose. And so maybe the result of that is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady working together to change that, to make equal rights um, for women. Then we have Dennis Banks. So why do you think that Dennis Banks started to work to make sure that his group was being represented? Do you think that his group was being represented well before that? And so now when you think about all of these causes and effects, these are reasons why they're known as heroes. Let's go ahead and read our next page, page 245, Around the World, Humanitarian Heroes Around the World. And here we have Clara Barton, a pioneer in nursing and a National Red Cross organization in action.
Some heroes work to make the world a better and safer place to live. These people are called humanitarian heroes. Clara Barton was one of these heroes. She helped get medicine and supplies to soldiers who were sick and hurt during the Civil War. She earned the nickname Angel of the Battlefield. When a war started in Europe, Barton helped provide supplies for people there. Barton also convinced people in the government to sign the Geneva Conventions. This is an agreement on how to treat sick and wounded soldiers. In 1881, she started the organization that is now known as the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross and other national groups are now part of an international group. It is called the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement. This group was the idea of Henry Dunant. He was a humanitarian hero from Switzerland. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement helps people around the world during war and natural disasters. The organization brings food and medical supplies, sets up places for people to stay, and helps them find loved ones who are missing.
So now that we've read about humanitarians, that means people who care about humanity, let's go ahead and talk about what that means, especially for the Geneva Convention, because you might not have heard of that term before. So the Geneva Convention were laws that were made in order to make sure that during even wartime, people were not being oppressed, and that regular people who were the victims of a war were not being taken advantage of or abused in some way. Because it's very common that during war times, a lot of rules are broken and that no one is taking care of regular people. So the Geneva Conventions were one way that people hoped to make a universal set of rules that everyone agreed that we would not do these things because we all agree mutually that we should not do this. And so with the Geneva Convention, that was the hope. And then we have the Red Cross, or the American Red Cross, also known as the Red Crescent Movement, which was to help people, regardless of who they were, for medical attention or in order to make sure that they are not being neglected, which means that they're not being ignored. So when we think about Clara Barton, she is an American person who did that. And she and the US government were trying to make sure that the sick, wounded, or injured people, no matter which side they were on, that all of the countries would agree on how to treat sick people, or if they were wounded or hurt or something, including enemy soldiers during war. They tried to make a universal law that they would not be hurt, especially if they were under the protection of the Red Cross. And so all of these people, they were all trying to bring fairness or equality to all people. They were all heroes in their own different ways. Maybe they're humanitarian heroes, maybe they're heroes in, their own communities, because they're trying to make sure that everyone has a safe place to live, has safe conditions, that they are not in danger. And so whether it's Dr. Martin Luther King, Elizabeth Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, or Banks, all of them are trying in their own ways to make sure that everyone has equal and fair treatment. And so we saw that Barton and Dunant brought medical assistance and aid to people during the war and during natural disasters with their creation of the Red Cross. Let's go to our next page. So we're going to be reading about Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the president's wife. And so we're going to read about how she could be perceived or understood as an American hero.
Eleanor Roosevelt was born in New York in 1884. In 1905, she married Franklin D. Roosevelt. Her husband began working in politics. She helped him with his work. Franklin Roosevelt became governor of New York in 1929. He was elected president in 1932. Eleanor Roosevelt changed the role of First Lady. She often traveled around the country for President Roosevelt. This was because Franklin had a disease called polio. This made it hard for him to walk and to travel. When she returned from her trips, she told the president what she had seen. She also wrote a newspaper column and spoke at meetings. As First Lady, Mrs. Roosevelt worked for the rights of women, African Americans, and other groups. Eleanor Roosevelt continued to work for Americans even after she was no longer the First Lady. She worked at the United Nations. There, she helped write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document lists basic rights that all people should have. It says that all people have the right to life, liberty, and security. Many of the rights listed in this document are also found in the United States Bill of Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt spent her life helping others. The work she did helped to bring equality to many people.
So Eleanor Roosevelt was a little bit different from previous first ladies because in the past, women were not necessarily viewed as someone who could be important, or someone that was um, someone who should be given roles of authority. So they were not necessarily allowed to lead. They were not necessarily allowed to give their opinions about different topics. And so all of these thoughts were a little bit changed when Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the first women to do that, because it was a secret that President Roosevelt had polio, and it was a secret because they did not want people to think that he was weak because he had an illness that prevented him from being able to walk. And so, because of all of these different things, she was given a lot more authority, a lot more command than previous first ladies. She was allowed to do things that previous first ladies had not been. And she kind of is one of the reasons why today first ladies or the wives of the presidents are viewed as their own individual person who is allowed to go and do things in American politics, because they are not just the wife of the president, but they're also someone who is someone who connects to the president for what situations are going on. So we see this happens here with Eleanor Roosevelt receiving a pin from the Red Cross. And let's go ahead and read in their words, Eleanor Roosevelt. It is not a treaty. It is not an international agreement. It is not and does not purport to be the statement of law or of legal obligation. It is a declaration of basic principles of human rights and freedoms, to be stamped with the approval of the General Assembly by formal vote of its members, and to serve as a common standard of achievement for all peoples of all nations. Talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as in a list of rules that they think everyone should follow for what everyone deserves, for what they think everyone should have. And so here we have a photo of her holding it in 1947, and this is from her speech in 1948. So she used difference because first ladies were not politically active. That means they weren't necessarily trying to change situations. They were usually following whatever their husband did, and that was it. They were not allowed to make speeches or go to events and represent the president or represent the American government. When we think about the purpose of the Declaration of Human Rights, well, we know that it lists human rights and freedoms that all countries should achieve. So why was she able to have this level of power? Well, because of President Franklin Roosevelt being sick with polio and being unable to do these things, she was able to do more, and she was given the authority to do more. And so that can be another cause and effect. And I want you to think about whether or not you would consider Eleanor Roosevelt to be a good citizen. And why do you think that she would be or wouldn't be a good citizen? Do you think that she was someone who was also trying to benefit her community? Or do you think that she was someone that was working just so that way she could become powerful for herself? We're going to go ahead and get started on our next pages. Heroes make changes in their communities. And so we're going to see how they can do that.
Heroes are found everywhere. Some heroes fought for equality in education. Before the 1950s, African American students and white students in many states were not allowed to go to school together. They were segregated, or legally separated. Linda Brown lived in Topeka, Kansas. She had to attend school a mile from her home, even though there was one much closer. The school near her home was for white children only. She was not allowed to go there. She had to attend a school for African American students. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court heard her case. The case was called Brown v. Board of Education. Before Brown v. Board of Education, Sylvia Mendez's family fought against school segregation in California. In 1943, students of Mexican descent were not allowed to go to school with white students. Her case, Mendez v. Westminster, ended segregation in California schools. The case was argued by Thurgood Marshall, the same lawyer who argued Linda Brown's case in Brown v. Board of Education. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that in education, separate can never be equal. It ended the legal segregation of schools. Linda Brown's court case changed segregation laws. As an adult, Linda Brown continued to speak out against segregation. Not all heroes become famous. Heroes are people who take action when they see a problem in their communities. They may clean trash from the side of a road or the local park. Some heroes visit the elderly and help them with chores. Other heroes plant new seeds on hillsides after a large fire. All of these people do what they can to make their communities better places to live. Sometimes only a few people know what they have done, but they are still heroes.
So now that we've read about Brown v. Board of Education, or what happened with Sylvia Mendez's family in California, we know that this was a problem across the United States. Whether you were African American, whether you're Hispanic, whether wherever you were from, if you were not white, you were not allowed to go to a white school. And so a way that they fought against this and this discrimination, because it is segregation based on race, was that they took these cases to court and they argued that this was not fair. And they proved it, they showed it. And so these two are another example of how you might not think that this is a big deal, because you think that, oh, everywhere now, everyone is allowed to go to every school. But because of them, we are able to go to any school inside the United States. You don't just have to go with your own group. If you are living in an area and the school is closer to you, you are entitled, you are allowed to go to a school that is mixed, that has everyone from everywhere all in it. And so why do you think that that could be important? If everyone is only the same group, do you think that they're going to be sharing different ideas, or do you think that they're all going to be essentially saying the same thing? If you're not dealing with other groups, if you're not talking to other people, if you're not learning about other cultures, your ideas are probably going to stay the same, and you're probably going to think that your group was better than another group. And here's the thing. If you're working with other people, you realize that every group has their own positives, has their own negatives. And so when you're working together, that is another way that you are able to unlearn things that you might have learned in the past, which weren't good, and also learn new things from other people. And so now they use their lawyers in order to fight segregation. They were able to argue that the Constitution didn't say this is allowed. And then at the end, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. The Supreme Court agreed with them and said, yes, you're correct. This is not fair for our students. But when we talk about heroes, yes, these are some famous people, and these are just barely some of the people who are famous in American history. But don't forget, as it said on this page, that not all heroes become famous. There's even a saying, not all heroes wear capes. As in, you might not be able to physically see that someone is doing something heroic, but just because it's not something extremely big doesn't mean that it's not heroic. A hero is a person who is trying to benefit their community by trying to make it better for other people. So you can think of someone in your own community. Maybe you have an uncle, maybe you have an aunt who is trying to make your community safer. Maybe your own parents are trying to make your community better. And so, in that definition, we could say that those people are heroes. They're local heroes, even. So, there might be, national heroes, as in someone who's done something for the whole country. Maybe there's a state hero because they did something for the state. Maybe they're a city hero because they did something for the city. But don't forget, there are heroes in your everyday life. The question is whether or not you see them. And so we saw here helping someone who needs assistance, that can be heroic because that is doing something to help someone else. So now that we found all of these different causes and effects, you can go ahead and start answering on page 231. Let's go ahead and go back to that. So we listed a lot of different causes, a lot of different effects that happened as a result of unfair laws, discriminatory practices, different things that were happening in the world, all over the world at the time. And of course, this is in history, but this is not to say that these things don't happen now. There are still things that happen now that are unfair and that people are trying to actively fix. Heroes are not just people of the past. Heroes are people who are alive as well. So once you're done with that, we can go ahead and get started here. So before you get started, think and examine, review your research. What are some problems in the past that people have tried to solve? So we've talked a lot about different ways that heroes in the past tried to make things equal, tried to fight for something that they thought was correct. But now we're going to be thinking about a cause and effect and writing about it. Choose one of the issues in the past that caused people to take action. What was the issue? How did people work to solve the issue? What were the effects of their actions? So we see that in our reading, there were lots of different things that happened that caused different results. So we saw lots of different causes, different effects. You are going to choose one of them. So it could be anything from one of the ones that you've listed here. And then you're going to choose and explain what were they fighting back against. Were they fighting back against the government? Maybe they were fighting back against a law. Maybe they're fighting back against their community. Maybe they're fighting back against something else. And you're going to say, how did they try to solve that problem? Well, if you want to talk about Martin Luther King, that's a famous example because we know that in the past, the laws were not in his favor. So he had to fight back against the government at the time in order to say, hey, I don't think these laws are right. I think that we should try to do something to change it. And I think we should do it in this way. Well, then you need to explain how he did it. How did he go about that? Once you're done with that, you can go ahead. I'm not saying you have to choose Martin Luther King. I'm just giving an example. So you can choose any of the people that we've talked about in our lesson, but make sure you show that where you got it from. You are not making up answers. You are taking it directly from the text. As in, you are going to get your information from the text. You are going to paraphrase it in your own words. Then you are going to be connecting to the essential question because you're going to be writing about ways that people can work together to solve problems in a community. We talked about the different branches of government and how they're all interconnected in order to work together. And then when we think about problems that happen in different communities, do you think that the community will just leave the problem alone, or do you think that they're going to try to fix it? And so, in what ways do you think they're going to try to fix it? Maybe they're trying to pass a law. Maybe they say this is not a problem just with our community. Maybe it's a problem across the whole state. So they try to make it um, a law for their state using their state government. Maybe they think it's a problem that's in their whole country, so they try to pass a law across the United States. Why do we all have laws about seatbelts? Why do you think that that was an issue? And so I want you to think about different ways people can work together to fix different problems that they have. And then you're going to be answering that question on page 233. That's the end of this video lesson. I know it's quite long, but there were lots of details here that you needed to go over in order to understand how heroes are not just famous people. They're also regular people who do good things. All right. I will see you in our next video lesson.